afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to this very special lecture. Our speaker today is Loyd Auerbach. Loyd is the director of the Office of Paranormal Investigations, a consulting editor for Fate magazine, and a faculty member for both JFK University and the Rose Ridge campus of the American School of Professional Psychology. He is also an author of 1 audio tape and 4 books, the most recent of which is Mind Over Matter. His first book, ESP Hauntings and Poltergeist, was named the Sacred Text of Ghosts by Newsweek in 1996. He is a performing mentalist. He's on the board of directors of Bay Area Magicians Club 53 and a member of the Psychic Entertainers Association. He has appeared on hundreds of radio shows and dozens of local television and national TV shows, including Unsolved Mysteries, The Today Show, Oprah, Sightings, and Late Night with David Letterman. He is constantly haunting reruns on the Discovery Channel and A&E, so watch for him. He is recently featured in the March 1998 issue of Southwest Airlines in-flight magazine, Spirit. Loyd holds a degree in cultural anthropology and a graduate degree in parapsychology and has been investigating the paranormal for close to 20 years. Let's give a warm round of applause for Mr. Loyd Auerbach.
Thank you. And of course, I wrote that, so it had to sound good. I'd like to welcome you all here to a little exploration of what on television is called the X-Files. Of course, there's a bit of a history to that whole aspect, and I'm not really a UFO guy, but I've done some work in UFOs. I don't deal with a lot of the things you see in the X-Files, but there's a small part of that which actually is a bigger part of the whole world and people's experience. And that is exploring psychic abilities, exploring ghosts, poltergeists, apparitions, and that's the part of the X-Files I'm going to talk to you about today. Now, first, I want to get a kind of a feel for the audience. So how many of you believe in UFOs? Raise your hands. Okay. How many of you believe in ESP? Raise your hands. How many of you believe in Bigfoot? Raise your hands. How many of you believe in big feet? Raise your hands. And how many of you believe in ghosts? Raise your hands. And how many of you believe in mind over matter? Raise my hand. Good. That's good. Well, let me kind of put things in perspective for you a little bit. I'll start out with telling you part of a story that I'll finish off later on. It's a story that actually would have called out Scully and Mulder, I think, except for the fact that the FBI really does not go out on cases in the paranormal, unless, of course, there's a kidnapping by an alien, in which case the kid or adult's gone, and they have to look at it a kidnapping and look for a ransom note, and it's really hard to get when you have to translate it from Epsilon Eridanian or something like that. Very tough. Several years ago, when I was working at JFK a little bit more full-time, we got a call at the university from a woman who claimed that she was being strangled, choked, grabbed, picked up by a shadowy entity in her home, at her boss's house, and a number of other places. And in fact, she had the bruises on her throat to prove it. As part of her establishment for herself of credibility, she told us that she was a cop in San Francisco for a number of years, had been living in Alaska for about 10 years as a police officer also, and was back in the Bay Area working security for a couple of high-tech companies. So it was one of those high-tech security jobs where they had to keep out a lot of other folks. So we invited her down to the university because I needed to see the marks on her throat. I didn't want to see anything other than pure physical evidence. When somebody actually says that they're being choked by something, we have to see that something's going on, because there could be somebody else involved, such as a boyfriend, a husband, and that's something else we have to check out. So she came in. She brought with her a witness, one of her coworkers, who she said saw her being picked up, held against the wall, and choked by nothing. She came in with a scarf around her throat. She took off the scarf, and there were bruise marks in the shapes of fingers on her throat. I turned to her associate and said, "Did you see these marks appearing?" He said, "Yes, I saw the marks appearing." Turned back to her and said, "What happened?" And she told us, it was myself and a colleague, that in fact she was at her captain's house for a party, went to the ladies' room, or the restroom in the house, down the hall. Everybody else was in one room. She came out of the bathroom and saw this figure that had been bothering her for 6 months, standing there, if a shadow can stand. It came towards her, grabbed her by the throat, and picked her about 3 feet up off the ground, she said. Then it threw her on the ground. I turned immediately to her associate. "What did you see?" We heard her scream. We saw her sliding down the wall, but none of us saw her off the ground. But we did see depressions on her throat as if something was strangling her, and we saw the bruising appear. I said to him, what did you think of that? He said, I didn't even want to think about it, nor did anybody else. Now, this had been going on for 6 months. It continued even to our visit to the house. And I'll tell you about that a little bit later. This is going to whet your appetite. So, for all of you, you're walking along the street. You see a friend of yours walking towards you. He says hi, and then disappears. You think, okay, you blanked out for a second, he's gone. But then you go home and you call your friend. You say, you know, where'd you go? I just saw you in downtown Walnut Creek or wherever. He said, I wasn't there. I was home. But you know, I was thinking about calling you at that very moment. Common experience, believe it or not. You're in your house with your kids. You hear your son or daughter talking to somebody in the living room while you're in the kitchen. You go into the living room, and there's the child talking to somebody sitting on the couch who's not answering back. He's sitting there reading a newspaper, flipping the pages. You start addressing this figure, flips the page one more time, and disappears. Another report that we've gotten. These cases come to us from all over the world, although we do investigations myself in the Bay Area primarily. And they're really interesting because they do point to something going on that Mulder would be very happy to investigate. Scully, on the other hand, might not be. What we do when we go out on these investigations as a Ghostbuster is we don't bust the ghosts. I mean, for a number of years before the X-Files started up, I have to say that when people said, what do you do? I said, you know, Ghostbuster. Now I say X-Files, and then they immediately say aliens. Well, we talk about ghosts a little bit more. The whole idea here is that we are dealing in that realm of the human mind called parapsychology. It's the field that I was trained in. It's a subfield of many other fields, in fact. And it deals with interactions of the human mind, how our minds interact with the rest of the world around us in very unusual ways. And they're unusual only because today we think they're unusual. A science fiction writer named Kathleen Sky once said, there's no such thing as a supernatural. There are only things we don't understand yet. And this has been the history of science all along. Parapsychology is a field in search of answers. When we have those answers, we won't have parapsychology anymore. We'll have something else. So we deal with things that you probably know quite a bit about. Extrasensory perception, or as a colleague of mine calls, extended sensory perception. Our senses, which, by the way, how many senses do we have, folks? Take a survey here. How many senses do we have? I'm guessing here. Just call them out. 6, 5, okay? Actually, if you talk to some folks in psychology and physiology, we have up to 27. If you start counting the different senses of taste and the different senses of touch. But for the most part, we think of sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. We think of those things. We actually do have a sixth sense. Clearly, physiologically have a sixth sense that nobody ever thinks about, or very few people think about. And that's our sense of space and time. It's our sense of balance. We have a physical structure inside, right in the inner ear, that keeps our position in space. We know about that, and it helps us orient ourselves. That is a real sense. In other words, we sense or perceive the world around us. And we have other ways of perceiving the world around us, and other ways of interacting with the world around us. Actually, we have a seventh sense, which is very important to everybody. It's called common sense. And we have another sense that I think we can't live without, and that's called sense of humor. But of course, I know a lot of skeptics who don't have that one. When you start talking about sense, you're talking about perceiving. And when I see you out there, when you're seeing me, it's not like a camera seeing somebody. What you're doing is you're getting information through your eyeball, through your eyes. It's going into your brain, and your brain, depending on how you've learned to see things as you grow up, is translating it. You know, when NASA sends up those probes, and we get those wonderful pictures from the Hubble Space Telescope and from the probes that are out there, if you actually saw the signal, it would look like a lot of ones and zeros. It's digital. It's coming through that way. A computer then constructs that or reconstructs that image and then has to enhance it. You've all heard computer enhancement. That happens with space probes all the time. That's what our eyes do. Our eyes provide not digital but analog signals. They provide the signals to our brain. Our brain converts that into something. And when people have a hallucination, they may actually really see something up here that their eyes are not seeing. Just like you can superimpose an image on a video camera. Two images, merge them together. We see that on TV all the time. Okay, that would have been the cheap way for David Copperfield to get rid of the Statue of Liberty. Much faster, just do a little wipe. It's really easy to do that. So we're seeing and perceiving are two different things. Hearing and perceiving what we hear are two different things. How many of you have been stuck in your cars with a song running through your heads that you can't get through, you can't get rid of? And you hear it. It doesn't sound the same, but you hear it up here. We can remember smells and really pick those up the same way. We can remember how things feel and even how things taste. So all that stuff is going on in our brains. And when you talk about extra or extended sensory perception, you're talking about extra information that doesn't seem to come from those normal senses. So we're picking up extra things that are outside the range of what we think our sight is, outside the range of what our hearing is, and so on. Now, I'm going to actually tell you something that just came through in one of the parapsychology journals about 2 weeks ago. I'm going to get to that when we talk about it later, but we found that there's, in England, a couple of researchers found a connection between low-frequency sound and some haunting cases, some ghost cases. So that's a really interesting thing I'll tell you about a little bit later, but it talks about how we perceive, how we see, how we experience the world around us. ESP, extrasensory perception. We all know two things about it. One, people predict the future, and two, people can read minds, right? At least that's what they do on TV and the tabloids. In fact, psychics don't read your mind. They might pick up things about you. They might connect with you. And in fact, most people who have a telepathic or mind-to-mind communication are people who have a close emotional bond. Not necessarily a physical bond. It's said that twins have a better bond than almost anybody. But in fact, that's if twins get along with each other, they have a much better bond. There are twins that don't get along. There are also sets of twins that have been reported around the world that have been separated at childhood, raised by different families, and when they find each other again, strangely enough, not only are their personalities similar, their likes are similar, the movies they've seen are similar, there's some sort of other bond that's going on, maybe genetic, but other things that are happening there too. It's been said that mothers and children have a close emotional bond, a close tie. And it's thought that when a mother senses a child or a mother animal senses a baby in danger, that they pick up on that. But strangely enough, one of my fellow students at JFK University, when I was studying for my master's degree, did a program, an experiment, looking at the ties between fathers and their children versus mothers and their children. And the one factor that came through is the parent that the child was closest to had the strongest telepathic connection. It didn't matter if it was a mother or a father at that point. It was that emotional connection that people have. That's telepathy. It's mind-to-mind communication. But in fact, we can also, from our research that we know this, and from psychics we know this, we can also pick up information from objects and events outside our field of sense that we think about. In science today, in parapsychology, we call this remote viewing. But the old term for it, which is still being used, is clairvoyance, clear seeing. You can get a vision or a picture in your head of things going on elsewhere. However, you can also feel or sense things going on in other places, too. That would be clairsentience. Clairolfaction, by the way, is smelling something that's going on someplace else, hopefully something good. And there's a clairauditory ability. The one sense, strangely enough, that doesn't seem to come up in almost any of the experiences people have is taste. Taste seems to be left out of almost every psychic experience, which is probably a good thing, given some things that could be tasting out there. I don't know if I really want to know what ectoplasm tastes like. It's bad enough when people smell things that are strange in places that you go to. So we have clairvoyance or remote viewing, perceiving things at a distance. We think of visions all the time, but very often people really do perceive through their sound accoutrements. They actually pick up sounds from a distance. They pick up sensations from a distance. And over the past 20 years or so, the remote viewing experiments, including those done by the military that were taken over by the CIA, have shown a really good hit rate. However, not good enough to put it to work for every corporation, fortunately. And not good enough to continue with the espionage work that people have done. So nobody's going to be able to spy really on your home from a distance. It's not something that you have to worry about, although I get calls like that all the time. My neighbor is spying on me. Well, how do you know your neighbor's spying on you? I sense the neighbor's presence here in the room. And usually these things turn out to be a little touch of paranoia, or certainly a little bit of a rivalry with a neighbor that's going on. Maybe the neighbor even said, you know, I'm psychic. Because if you really want to get somebody who's prone to believing that, you just have to say, you know, I'm psychic. And I'm thinking about you right now. You have to be a little careful with that. The thing we see in the tabloids the most, precognition, predicting the future. Now, here's the thing. If I predict the future, how many of you follow the predictions that you see here on TV and in the tabloids, and sometimes they're even printed in some of the local newspapers? A lot of the skeptics follow them, just look at the hit rate. And in fact, the people who are doing the tabloids, which are the ones that are looked at all the time, are paid to do those predictions. And they basically, I talked to one of them, and she said she sits down and she throws darts at a dartboard. She doesn't even try, and she's a working psychic, but she doesn't do anything about it. She says it's worth the money, it's worth the publicity. She doesn't care if she's right or wrong, because she's predicting things that either anybody could predict that would come true, or, for example, I can tell you right now, as a prediction, okay, the night before January 1st, 2000, last night, 1999, there will be several things happening. Wild parties all over the place. Unfortunately, suicides. A lot of suicides, something psychologists are predicting. People who either can't face the turn of the millennium, think the world is going to come to an end because they pay too much attention to these psychics in the tabloids, or computer programmers who know that computers are going to go down on January 1st, 2000, and they don't want to be around for it. And that's the other prediction I can make, is that a lot of psychics, when computers and other problems, we have a major computer issue happening in the year 2000, when they start creating problems, a lot of psychics are going to start, who did predict earthquakes and other major disasters, will suddenly change their tune and say that was a metaphor for the computer problems, because they're going to want to take credit for it. So there are doomsayers who catch people's attention all the time, and that's not how precognition works. Most people who have psychic experiences about the future pick up things about the future that are so mundane, for the most part, like having a dream about something that actually happens to you at work the next day that's totally irrelevant. Sometimes it may be something important. One woman wrote to me that she and her mother had a simultaneous dream about visiting a house, and they both were able to describe the exact same house. Now, as it happens, they were about to visit the mother's sister, who had just moved into a new home in Michigan. And they had not been there. They didn't know what she had. She apparently hit it big with some money, whether it was a husband or something else. She hit it big with some money, and she bought a lot of new furniture. So they went and started walking towards the house, and as they got to the outside of the house, which was a couple hours away, they both looked at each other and said, "That's the house in the dream." They walked inside, and they were able to describe the house before they get into any part of it, both of them. So they had a precognitive dream about their visit to that house and about what was going on. The dream, by the way, happened a couple weeks before some of the furniture was even in the house. Interesting. People have dreams about disasters. Those are warnings. There was a woman who wrote to me and said she had a dream about a friend of hers dying in a car accident on a trip to Tahoe, Lake Tahoe. So she told her friend. Now, that's very dangerous in some respects, because when people tell relatives and friends, the friends might, in fact, think you're crazy. They might laugh it off. And then when it happens, they could, if they're still alive after that, they could come back and think, you're a witch. Something's wrong with you. Or they could ask you for the lotto numbers, which is another difficulty in general. But in this case, the woman told her friend actually paid attention. For whatever reason, maybe it was something about the way the woman told her. She didn't go with her friends. Her friends died in a car accident on a road to Lake Tahoe. And she would have been in that car. All of them, they turned over, flipped off the road, literally, and they all died. Now, the friend didn't tell her friends, because as it is, she was just doing it as a favor to her friend, the psychic, the person who had the experience. These were not psychics. These were people who had these experiences. And these are things that people pick up all the time. There was one episode of the XFiles where Peter Boyle played a general, just typical guy who suddenly had precognitive experiences. The average guy, he wasn't a psychic, he wasn't trying to be a psychic, he just had these experiences, and these are things that people don't like to experience. People often want to turn this off, and people often call us in parapsychology to ask, how can I turn this off? I keep on seeing a disaster happening to somebody. And the fact is that this woman who told her friend not to go because she saw her die on the road to Lake Tahoe, granted they weren't able to save the friends, but she saved her friend's life. Now think about that for a second. She changed the future. She caused the future that she foresaw to not happen the exact same way. And that's one thing that we've learned in parapsychology, is that people can intervene and change the future if you take responsibility for what you see, for your own lives. It's not fate necessarily that pours it into us. There are some things like, I see an earthquake's going to happen tomorrow. You can't really stop the earthquake, but if enough people could get out of the way of the earthquake, which is not always possible in that case, then maybe you can save some people's lives. Telling people to stand, say, I see an earthquake tomorrow, and I see you standing right by a bookcase. Don't stand there. Okay? Because if you stand there, the bookcase is going to fall on top of you. I just changed his future. If I see somebody else, you're going to get into a car accident because of the earthquake. Don't drive at 2 o'clock. That's when the earth's going to start shaking. That can change people's individual futures. But it takes responsibility. Is very important for that. Now that's all the perceptive part of ESP, of psi ability. We call this psi, it's the 23rd letter of the Greek alphabet. It means absolutely nothing except that. It's just like the X factor. We call it the psi factor if you want to call it that. And in actuality, that's only a small part, but that part is very important to the idea of ghosts. If you walk into a house or a building and get a feel, this is all something that happens to probably everybody. You walk into a building, you get a feel for the building, good vibes, bad vibes, that sound familiar to everybody? Okay. Sometimes the bad vibes check out, like you find out your friends just had a fight, or something terrible happened in that place. Maybe this is a building you've never been to and you learn later on that there was actually a murder or something else that happened there. People pick things up without realizing what they're picking up. That's a form of clairvoyance that people often call psychometry. And the traditional form of that is a psychic holds an object and tells something about the history of that object. Who owned it? Where did it come from? And there actually have been some good psychics in that area who've worked with archaeologists to try to describe where some artifacts have come from when they've been out of place. If you walk into a place and didn't just get a feeling, but you saw a figure walking towards you down a hallway, and that figure then disappeared as he got towards you, and the next night you were there, you saw that same figure walking down the hallway towards you and disappear right before they got to you. And the next night again, same thing, same time. Or at 3 o'clock in the morning, every night, there were sounds coming from a particular room. Nothing's in that room, but it's a regular pattern. It may be that what you're perceiving is something that happened in that house prior to the time that you're there that just got recorded, if you want to call it that, into the environment. Now, one of the things we do in haunting cases, because they do relate to ESP, is we found, through a suggestion of one of our colleagues up in Canada, that magnetic fields of unusual intensity, not really high, but higher than background, actually show up at the spots where people see the ghost, you might say. This is a simple magnetic field detector. It's called a tri-field meter. There's a number of them on the market. They're sold not for ghosts. They're sold actually to find out if you have electromagnetic pollution in your home, because you don't want to be around high-intensity electromagnetic fields. So we think right now. The thing about science right now is it's always changing. There are some studies that indicate that people have around high-tension wires have a higher incidence of leukemia, yet there are other groups that don't. And so there are other things about health benefits and health problems that people have with magnetic fields. But what we have found is, and by the way, if I get this near anything, including the microphone, it's going to go up. It comes off of technology. We put off magnetic fields because of that. And when I go into the haunting cases, what I usually find is if the figure walks down the hallway, that hallway has a higher than background magnetic field, even if we turn the power off in the house. If somebody sees or hears footsteps in a room, where the footsteps seem to occur has a higher than background magnetic field, even if the power's off, which is unusual. We're not sure what to make of this yet. Some physicists I've talked to have said that it can't be the magnetic field, but maybe that's attached to something else that's going on. So we haven't quite gotten the lock on it. But what's very clear in these haunting cases is that there's no ghost there. Let's define this for a second. We all have consciousness, minds, at least we hope we do. At least we think we do. A ghost, or what we call an apparition, is a consciousness or a personality of a person that survives the death of their body, that somehow is outside their body, is able to communicate, and that communication or interaction is very important. If you are watching a video monitor, and this is a colleague, let's say, at work, and the person's talking to you, if this was a video conference, you could talk back, and the person would recognize that you were there, and it's a two-way communication. That would be the ghost communication. If it was a videotape that you're watching and you talk back to the TV and it just keeps talking because it's just a videotape, that would be what we would call a haunting. It's a recording. Okay? So we have interaction and intelligence. We have a recording. And the thing about this whole idea of ESP that's very important is for a ghost to communicate with you, but not to everybody else. If you've all seen any of the old Topper movies, or in fact, any ghost movie out there, if you've seen Ghost with Patrick Swayze, Whoopi Goldberg could hear him, but nobody else could, except for, of course, other ghosts. So we have a communication going on that's not auditory. Whoopi Goldberg's character heard his voice in her head. It was telepathic, mind-to-mind communication. If she saw him, she would have seen him in her head, a picture that somehow he sent to her. But if you recall also in the movie, there was one other thing that happened. He tried moving things. Couldn't move things until he ran into a slightly psychotic ghost on the subway in New York who was knocking everybody's newspapers over, and he cornered the guy and said, "How do you do this?" And the guy said, basically, you push with your mind, because we don't have anything. We don't have hands. We're just mind, consciousness. Pretty important thing for a psychotic ghost to say, especially somebody who spends his days and nights on subways just knocking people's newspapers out of their hands. So Swayze concentrated, was able to eventually move things. And that's really interesting because most apparitional cases do not include things that move. Some do, after a while typically, but not just after a person's died. Typically. Now I'm going to get back to that in a second. It seems that it takes a little while for a ghost to learn how to do these things. to move things. But the majority of ghost cases are single sightings of apparitions. A relative or friend of yours has died. You wake up from a dream, you see the person standing at the foot of your bed. Or it's broad daylight, person just appears right in front of you and essentially either says goodbye or something falls off the shelf while they're standing there, or perhaps you have an item that was owned by that person and it just simply flies off the shelf, or a clock stops that they had given you. So there's some momentary connection that you make in your mind to that person. And most people who see this know that either something has happened to that person or that person has died, and it's verified a little bit later on. Now, some of those cases are situations where the person was a grandparent or some other relative that if I saw the ghost, I knew that that person was in the hospital on his or her last legs. And I might have to think about all the other times that day that I thought that that person had died. So I have to kind of look at the range. But if it's just the one time, and I had no idea that the person was even sick or got caught in a car accident, you have to look at that as a momentary communication. So most ghosts show up to people 24 to 48 hours after the person's died, and that's it. They don't stick around. At least if they stick around, they don't talk to people. The ones that do stick around and talk to people sometimes do that because they are with the family. We had a wonderful case when I was working in New York City years ago at the American Society for Psychical Research. A couple of my colleagues went out on a case in Brooklyn where a woman had died. Her daughter and son-in-law were in Brooklyn with her grandchildren, and a couple days after she died, she started showing up to the family. Now, this caused especially great concern to the son-in-law because he didn't want his mother-in-law hanging around at the time, except that he actually had a pretty good relationship with her. And in fact, what ended up happening was the kids liked having her around, like the ghost, and the parents even reported that the grandmother would show up every night and tuck them into bed. In fact, after a few months, they said that they would walk in after they'd put the kids to bed, not tucking the covers in, the covers would be tucked in from the outside. And the kids would say that Grandma tucked me in, Grandma told us a story. They figured if they could just rely on her as a babysitter, they'd be home free, but that was not something that reliable, unfortunately. And she stayed with them, last time I checked was about, with my colleagues, was about 1988, and this is 82 when the case actually happened. So for a very long time, this ghost was there. I had another great case in Livermore a number of years ago. It was the kind of the case that made me think, hey, these things are real. I was a little skeptical about ghosts. I had psychic experiences, had never had any encounters with ghosts, didn't exactly know what was going on here. But I was called on a case, and I will get back to that choking ghost case in a bit, by the way. I was called on a case to Livermore. This is a woman who is an attorney, very level-headed woman. She called up and said, what do you do when you've got a teenager who sees a ghost and talks to her every day? And I said, what do? You're his mother. Well, as it happens, we took him to a counselor to make sure that he was going to be growing up okay. And the therapist was going to come into the picture later on. The therapist said, he's fine. I said, have you seen the ghost? She said, well, yeah. Your husband seen the ghost? Well, yeah. Oh, and my mother's seen the ghost too. But not every day. We don't talk to her every day. Chris talks to her every day. And I said, what do you want? Do you want us to come in and get rid of her? No, we don't want her to get rid of her. I just want you to come and we thought this would be a really interesting case for you. And you might be able to learn something. I said, okay, we'll come on over. So myself and a couple of students from JFK University went over there. And we learned a lot of things. We talked to the boy. It was the boy and the mother, and her mother, her husband, Mark, was out of town at the time. Pat's husband was out of town. And we found a number of things out. Number one, this is a very old house in Livermore, for Livermore. It was built in the early part of the century. The woman who had previously owned the place was born in the house and died, not in the house, but died while she still owned the house. And that was about 3 years before they moved in. The house sat there as a part of the family trust, essentially. It was essentially sold in an estate sale. They bought the house. They bought some antiques, including a porcelain doll collection, a number of other things. A beautiful house, Victorian house. Shortly after they bought the house and moved in, Pat, her husband Mark, and her mother, all, when her mother was over, all separately started seeing a woman walking up and down the stairs, staring at them, and Pat said, I swear she waved at me a few times. They didn't say anything to each other. Not a word. For about a year and a half, this had been going on. Every once in a while, all the family members were seeing the ghost independently, not knowing that anybody else was, because they didn't want to think or make the others think that they were crazy. One day, their 12-year-old son, Chris, is walking over into the room over by the porcelain doll collection, and he says, Mom, you know where these come from? And Pat says, well, not exactly. We haven't really kind of checked. Oh, well, this one comes from Germany. And this one, and he starts running down the list of where these are from. And Pat says, did you find anything that the woman left behind? No, Lois told me. Who's Lois? The ghost, Mom. You know, the ghost that you, Dad, and Grandma are seeing all the time but don't want to say anything about. So Pat was a little confused. How do you know that we're seeing a ghost? Well, Lois told me. She said she even waved at you once. You didn't wave back. Why didn't you wave back, Mom? Well, this was kind of interesting to Pat in many respects. First of all, it verified that somebody else had in fact seen the ghost. She immediately talked to her husband and her mother, confronted them about this, and they all admitted to seeing the ghost. She then got back to Chris and said, okay, so tell me what's going on with this ghost. Oh, she just stops by every day. You know, I talk to her. I talk to her about school. I talk to her about just sports, about everything that's going on. She sometimes watches TV with me. Pat took him to a counselor. Not because, again, she thought he was crazy, because, in fact, they had all seen the ghost, too. But I met with a therapist before we even went out there. So this is just back up for a second. The therapist, after talking to her an hour about this, said, you know, if every 12 or 13-year-old boy had an adult female he could talk to directly and honestly, we would have a much better adjusted society. He said, this kid is one of the best adjusted kids he'd ever met, which is great. So he said, I don't even believe in ghosts. I don't care if this woman's an imaginary friend or not. This is a good thing for this boy. So we went into the house. We had Chris tell us a little bit about what's going on. We walked around the house. We talked about Lois and her life. We got on tape a recording of Chris telling us all sorts of family anecdotes that Lois told him. Later on, by the way, we checked out. We found one and the only living relative of Lois, a cousin who was 92 at the time. He's dead now. And when we approached him through Pat was able to arrange that and talk to him about some of these family anecdotes, he finished these stories for us. So actually, we had very factual confirmation that these things had really happened to Lois. We asked Lois some questions. We actually sat down in the living room. You have to imagine this for a second. We have Pat and her mother on a couch. We have a nice easy chair which is empty. We have a nice other chair with Chris sitting next to it. And then the three of us sitting on other chairs. The easy chair, by the way, is where Lois was sitting, the ghost. And Chris would look at the chair, and we'd talk to the chair, and Chris would tell us what the chair said. Essentially, he was translating for Lois. So we were able to ask her some questions. One of the things that I was curious about was the fact that Lois, according to Chris, appeared sometimes as an old woman, sometimes as a teenager, sometimes as a little girl, sometimes as a woman in her 30s. So different appearance, but he always knew that it was her. And I said, well, how is this possible? When people talk about ghosts, they appear usually wearing the same clothing over and over again. Sometimes they might change clothing. But I had a curiosity back then, that a question that has occurred to me and to a few other people, and that was, where do ghosts get their clothes from anyway? Is there some kind of ectoplasmic department store up there? And why do some of them wear polyester? Not Lois, of course. She didn't wear polyester. So he said, or I should say, Lois told him that that's how she felt that day. She had a self-image. Think about it for a second. Close your eyes. Picture yourselves in your head. Okay, raise your hands if you're picturing yourselves naked. We never do that. We don't think of ourselves in the nude. We think of ourselves with clothes on. So if you've got a self-image that someone else can pick up, how we think of ourselves is how people see the ghosts. So when a ghost appears to somebody as a 30-year-old, that's probably how they think of themselves. Now that also means that we have occasional sightings of ghosts that look slightly non-human. And I had one case here in Concord, in fact, where it was like a blackish blob. And I worked with a psychic friend of mine who came in, and we talked to the folks there, and everybody got the impression that there was something wrong with this ghost. Kept on bothering everybody, but like there's something really wrong, that he was depressed. And in fact, he seemed like, as the psychic started talking to him, the psychic said, oh, he's not just depressed, he's a really low self-esteem issue here. And he thought of himself as nothing more than like a smudge on the earth, literally. So that's how people perceived him, was that way. So unfortunately, what that means is if a ghost hung around who was a truly bad person, that truly bad person might have a truly bad aspect that we could pick up on. But that's all in our minds. It's something we're picking up. Lois couldn't hurt Chris. Lois couldn't hurt anybody else. And in fact, this case is still going on. This is 10 years later, actually more than that. I will tell you that Lois stopped appearing to Chris on a regular basis when Chris discovered real girls. But then he realized he could talk to Lois about how to deal with the real girls. And he started talking to her again every day. So he got great advice from that. Now, that's all perceptual. if a ghost moved things, that's called psychokinesis, mind over matter. Now, I asked you before about that question about belief, and I raised my hand like this. In fact, if you look at the definition of psychokinesis in parapsychology, means the ability of the mind to interact with matter. That's this. Science does not know how the intent we have in our minds makes the right neurons fire, which cause the right muscles to move. So, as far as I'm concerned, and some of my colleagues, this is still all part of the same thing, the same as moving an object at a distance. It's probably part of the same process, in fact. How many of you have heard about people who have been in car accidents? Usually it's a woman thrown out of the car, child is trapped under the car, woman picks up the car, pulls the kid out, drops the car down. We hear about those stories all the time. I actually ran into a couple of doctors who examined a woman after this had happened to her, and neither one of them had asked themselves really good questions. This was actually at a cocktail party, and I was talking to them about this, and I mentioned this kind of thing, and one of the guys says, we had a case like this in the hospital a few months ago. And I said, well, did people actually witness her picking up the car? He said, yeah, the paramedics had just gotten there, and they saw this woman actually holding the car up. It wasn't like completely off the ground, but she had picked up with one hand, pulled the kid out with the other, and dropped the car. I said, okay, I got to ask you a couple questions here. What's she hurt? Well, she was thrown out of the car. She was scratched and bruised. The other guy was an orthopedic surgeon who said, you know, I didn't even think about this, but if she held that car up with her arm, torn ligaments, broken bones, there is no way that woman could have held that car up the way the human body is constructed. Now, we always hear that adrenaline is responsible for this. Adrenaline speeds up your body processes. It does not increase your innate strength. It cannot do that. It cannot increase the density of your bone. It cannot fix anything. There was something else that was going on in this woman's mind that allowed her to pick up this car and drop it back down. And my guess is that after being in this field for a while, that actually the car was being lifted up by her mind alone, and the only reason she needed to have her hand on it was because she'd freak out if she saw the car floating. And it would drop right back down on her kid. Think about it. It's much easier to accept that you get superhuman strength for a moment than your mind can actually lift something up off the ground. So, moving objects, the ability to push things around runs a good range from healing ourselves and other people to levitating and pushing things around. And of course, the ultimate end of the moving things around is the poltergeist case. What one of my colleagues years ago called recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. Happens again and again. Happens without control. It's spontaneous. And stuff moves. So basically what's going on here is someone, and most people think it's a ghost because poltergeist means noisy ghost. Just a label that the Germans applied to this over 100 years ago. In essence, in a poltergeist case, someone alive in the home is typically undergoing some kind of stress and is causing things to happen because they have no other stress relief valve. In other words, they're not throwing a temper tantrum. They're not breaking things. Well, I should say they're not consciously doing those things because things are breaking. Things are flying. Nobody's getting blamed. It's a way for us to release stress and tension in some cases. And you all experience this on occasion. I can tell you this right now. If you ever have problems, I can't say that all the problems that happen with computers are this way. But a number of researchers over the past 20 years have determined and found in experiments with computers that people who hate computers and have stress around computers cause computers to crash more frequently than the computers should actually crash. Strangely enough, people who are really, really good with computers have the opposite effect. There are people in the computer industry who apparently can make computers do things they shouldn't ought to be able to do. Interesting. Some people are function linked, and there are those of us that break things all the time. We are malfunction linked. We work both directions. And the poltergeist case is actually a situation in which things are moving because of stress. That's a little mini poltergeist when you cause your computer to crash. There are other effects like that. I had a case up in Westchester County a few years ago, New York State, where a woman claimed that all her appliances would go on from time to time, just spontaneously go on. They turned themselves on. And so all the appliances in the kitchen, the toaster would go on even though the thing wasn't pushed down. The microwave would turn on. The oven would everything would just turn on even though there were switches involved. The blender would start turning on. And in fact, a lot of these things would happen without them being plugged in. Witnessed by her husband. I said, okay, what's going on in your life? She actually thought she was responsible. What's going on in your life? Well, my husband and I just had a baby, and my husband and I are having some difficulties around, I said, around the baby? She said, no, around my going back to work. He doesn't want me to go back to work. I want to go back to work. I said, okay, let me make a wild guess here. Do things start happening in the kitchen whenever you start talking about work? And you're going back to work? And she said, well, yeah. I said, okay, does anything happen outside the kitchen? She says, yeah, actually, especially if my husband is watching TV when I'm trying to talk to him. Yeah. The remote control doesn't work. Every man's nightmare. In fact, it's instant channel surfing. The channels just keep on skipping over and over and over again, too fast for him to even see, is what she told me. So this was a matter of stress on her part, connecting to her husband and to the relationship around the work. And when they started dealing with this in a different way, the stuff stopped happening. We had another case where a family, again, in many poltergeist cases, people actually realize that they're causing these things. Not all the time. We have a lot of unconscious causes here. But we had a family situation in, it was down in Fremont, California, in which a family claimed that water bursts were going on right below the ceiling, consistently, just happening every day, just bursts of water as if a pipe had burst upstairs in the attic. Now, the first thing the father did was actually go to a plumber, have a plumber come in. No pipes in the attic. They kind of left that one out. It was not raining, no leaks. They had PG&E come in to see if there was any weird condensation effect. Checked everything out. Now, by the time they had Pacific Gas and Electric come in, however, there was one other thing that they knew. Whenever their son David, who was 13 at the time, was around, these water bursts would happen. They first thought that he was somehow causing them through fraud. He was throwing water balloons at the ceiling. So they watched him very carefully. And the other thing that occurred is that this would always happen whenever he would go over by a source of water. They really thought maybe he was doing something. Well, both of them, the husband and wife, watching this kid, switches on the water. All of a sudden, pop, 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 water bursts further down the hallway than he'd be able to actually be at. It was actually thought that maybe his brother was doing it in collusion, so they made sure that he was in the picture at the same time. And in fact, when the Pacific Gas and Electric technician came out and checked out the house, they said, okay, let's see if we can get David to do this now, because he was curious. And they put David over in the kitchen down the hallway. They could see him full view. They had the other kid there in view also. He turns on the water faucet, 5 bursts of water, the last one right above their heads. The guy from PG&E turns to them and says, you need another kind of expert. This is out of my field completely. All right, so talking to the boy on the phone, because they had all determined that he was responsible or involved in this, one thing became clear. And that was, very interestingly, that and he made sure his parents were out of earshot, by the way, when this happened. He had been swimming. He was on the swim team. Before that, he was into martial arts. And he dropped out of the martial arts after a couple of years because it started getting into the sparring and competition, and he did not want to get into the competition at all. But he didn't tell his parents that's why he wanted to drop out. He liked the martial arts, didn't like competing. They thought he liked swimming, let's put him on the swim team, so he starts going in on the swim team. Again, not realizing that what David had a problem was the competition. Think about it. Swim team, water bursts. One thing we weren't able to do, unfortunately, is get a sample for chlorine testing. It would have been interesting to see if it was actually pool water. What we did find out was that once everything was understood by the family, it stopped. Completely stopped. He got off the swim team, went swimming as he wanted to. They got him to other extracurricular activities. Not a problem at all. I will tell you 2 things here that happened. One, there was one other event that happened. The next time he got his report card, we had some water bursts again because there was some stress over the grades that he had. And the second thing is that the insurance company paid off on the water damage because a poltergeist is not an exclusion under most policies. Okay, it probably is now at this point. Well, these kind of cases are really interesting. When we go out and investigate them, we're dealing with some really interesting things. And this 1 meter is only one method we use to detect things. Actually, people are better detectors than devices are because it's the people that are having the experiences. Let me tell you again about that choking ghost. Let's go back to the beginning for a moment. This woman claimed that she was being choked by a shadowy entity. So we saw the marks in her throat. We talked to the witness. The next step was for us to go out to her home. She and her mother, because she had just moved back from Alaska 6 months before, shared an apartment in Pacifica. Right on the coast, they had a beautiful view of the ocean. It was a 1-bedroom apartment, which made things a little bit tight, and she was working up her salary to be able to get a place on her own. She slept on a sofa bed in the living room. The mother slept in her bedroom. Now, we got down there, and there were a couple things we noticed about the apartment. Number one, we walked in and we saw that they were very Catholic, which is not a good or bad thing in relation to these cases, except that has a lot to do with the interpretation of the shadow figure. The second thing we saw was a big stack of the Weekly World News and the National Enquirer, which they quickly tried to hide from us. They laughed it off, and you know, when people, it's one thing to subscribe to these things because actually they're fun to read, especially the Weekly World News. They make everything up. It's a lot of fun to read this stuff. I know a lot of disc jockeys around the country who read the Weekly World News. Probably that's the biggest part of their subscription base, in fact. And it's another thing when you talk to people who actually believe the stuff that appears in these papers, and I have over the years, and there was some indication that they did to some extent. The cover one, I still remember to this day, is Famed Psychic's Head Explodes in ESP Experiment. And when you turn and open it up, there's a picture of one of the characters in the movie Scanners, David Cronenberg's film, and that's where they got that headline from. It was from Scanners. So it actually the headline was misleading, the interior wasn't, for a change. So we sat there and talked to them, and we found out a couple things. Number one, this woman had a 16-year-old son. When she left California, he was 10 years before, he was 6. He stayed in custody with his father here in Walnut Creek. He would, since she came back to live in the Bay Area, he would come and visit once a month. Second thing we found, the attacks started also at the same time that the woman started having dreams, bad dreams. The dreams were about her father molesting her. She was having recovered memories without any prompting whatsoever about some sexual problems with her father when she was a child, and she was seeing a therapist for those. She, however, was not telling the therapist about the attacks by the shadow figure. And she also drew no connection between the two things in her mind. Because in her mind, it was clearly her father and this other thing that was doing something to her. It was punishing her for something. We then learned, as we're talking about this, that she was getting very uncomfortable. The woman got up, goes to the kitchen. Now you have to picture this for a second. You're all facing me. Okay? The kitchen is behind you. So my colleague and the mother was facing me. The woman went to the kitchen behind me. You can see the ocean behind me. She goes to the refrigerator. I'm watching her very carefully. She opens the refrigerator, gets a glass of water, drinks it, puts it back down, turns as if she hears something down the hallway. Turns back, turns again. Turns back, turns again. It's very dramatic. And she started walking out to the hallway and started looking down the hallway and shaking her head. And she walked back into the kitchen. Now, deductive reasoning, I assumed something was about to happen. So I was ready to pounce out of my chair. And in fact, what happened next is she went back to the refrigerator, turned around, screamed, and put her hands up like this. And before she hit the ground, I was actually by her side because I was already ready for this. Her mother and my colleague Sharon Soffin were a little bit, because of their backs to it, just a little bit surprised that this was going on. As they got to him, also, I had grabbed her hands, so her hands never touched her throat. I saw, and I don't believe in demons, but I saw depressions as if fingers were touching her throat. And she started choking. And I started seeing bruising under these finger marks. And she started choking out, "Get it away." Now, this is only about a year after I got out from New York. I moved out here from New York. So I grabbed her hands, holding her hands, and I used pretty much every four-letter word I knew from New York. I became a New Yorker again. And as a New York Ghostbuster, it worked really well because I said, I told it to leave her alone, not in so many words, and it would never come back again. I figured, why not go for broke? Stopped immediately. Okay, my thought was, okay, if this is really some sort of entity, he's afraid of Jews from New York. Not a bad thing, kind of encourages me for getting into this field to begin with, but I thought, no, that doesn't make any sense. There's something else going on. Got her up, got her calmed down, we started talking some more, she's more uncomfortable. Suddenly occurs to my colleague, where does your son sleep when he comes into this place? Well, my mother sleeps in the bedroom, and we've got this fold-out queen-size sofa bed, so he sleeps in the bed with me. When did the nightmares first start? When did your son first make his first visit? The nightmare started actually the same weekend that her son was sleeping in the same bed as her. The attack started 2 days later. The therapist, when she found out about the attacks, because we were able to get permission to talk to the therapist about this, literally said, "Oh my God, I've been trying to figure out what's going on here." The therapist, not having been to the home, didn't know all the other factors because the woman never told her. And so what happened here was a situation in which a woman conjured up her own demon, her own entity. It was punishing her for blaming her father for this stuff. So in essence, she was causing herself, she was feeling guilty about this, which is something that a lot of folks who have recovered memories of childhood abuse, They feel guilty that they did something wrong. And in fact, it was punishing her for this. Punishing her to the point where physically she was reacting. Now, you might think that this sounds like a really extreme reaction, but you have to remember, people make themselves sick all the time internally. People have been able to cause themselves to stop bleeding. The human body is capable of reacting to our own minds in very unusual ways. This happens to be just one more unusual way. You might say that this is a poltergeist case where the poltergeist agent directed it at herself instead of throwing things around. It seems to be that in these cases we have, the only time people get hurt, a couple instances. Number one, people get hurt because they see a ghost and they run and they fall. Okay? That sometimes happens with ghosts too. Any of you know who Patrick Van Horn is? He's a talk show host. Actually was on Day and Date for a while on CBS. Last year and the year before, he actually had a talk show here in San Francisco a number of years ago. And he told me a story years ago when I was first on his show. He said, off camera, of course, although he has admitted it now, admitted that he had a ghost in his farmhouse when he grew up, that he grew up in a house with a farmhouse, a haunted farmhouse. And one night, he claimed, the ghost, first of all, was appearing every single night. And walking down the hallway, he'd hear the footsteps. Everybody else would hear the footsteps. Sometimes they'd wake up, sometimes not. And it would just walk up and down the hallway very loudly. So one night he woke up, and he heard the footsteps in the room from his bedroom, and he got up and he decided, I'm going to go find out what's going on. And he walks into the hallway. This is when he was a teenager. And he hears the footsteps walking away from him. So he starts walking after the sounds. The footsteps are going faster. So he starts going faster. The footsteps head for the downstairs, going downstairs. So he starts heading that way. He hears the footsteps going down the stairs. He runs down the stairs. The footsteps head towards the living room. He heads that way. He hears a scuffling sound and a thud. He walks into the living room, and a throw rug is bunched up at the edge. He hears the sound of somebody getting up and brushing himself off, and that was the last time they heard or saw the ghost. So you can embarrass a ghost out of your house. Don't run from the ghost, chase him, especially if he can trip. The other time people get hurt is when in situations like the one with the choking ghost, where people really believe so intently that they can hurt themselves. And part of that can also be when an object is flying across the room. In a poltergeist case, you duck the wrong way. It's coming towards you. You don't duck into the path of the object. You try to duck away from the object. Things are usually not directed at people for the most part. Now, some of those cases, by the way, that we've done have been fraudulent. We've done a number of cases where things were all in people's minds. I had a wonderful poltergeist case which apparently fooled 27 California Highway Patrol officers. They didn't think it was a ghost or anything, but they had no explanation for the fact that they were in a house for a barbecue, and these rocks would start pelting the house, and things were moving around inside the house. And it was the result of a teenage boy and a couple of his friends. The boy was very unhappy in his new living situation. His stepfather, with a CHP officer, retired. He wasn't happy about that either. And so he came up with a plan with his friends to to make it seem like the place was haunted, because, as it happens, his parents were really into the paranormal. In fact, they used to come down to talk shows here in San Francisco anytime a psychic was on any of the local talk shows. So sometimes you play into that. We've also had cases where people have mistaken things for ghosts. But I want to tell you two last stories as we kind of close out for today, which would, I think, indicate my sense of wonder about this. And I think the reason I'm in this is because this stuff is really interesting. The truth is out there. You have to look for it, and you have to ask the right questions. Scully and Mulder on the X-Files look for the truth. Sometimes they uncover truths they don't want to know, and sometimes the truth is really in here. A number of years ago, and I'm going to have to pick up some notes here, I'm just going to read you the appropriate reference here, because I want to make sure I get this exactly right, the dates right. A man by the name of Deke Slayton. You know who Deke Slayton was? Astronaut, yep, one of the original 7. He was in charge of the Apollo program, in fact, and was on the Apollo-Soyuz mission. Deke Slayton died on June 13th, 1993 at 7:57 a.m. Texas local time. Died in Texas. He died at 3:22 a.m. in Texas of a brain tumor. At the time, his wife, Bobby, and his daughter were at his side. And the only other person who knew he had died was the doctor, who was also there, because he died in his home. At 7:57 a.m. California time, so this is a few hours later, the same day, at John Wayne Airport, Orange County, there was a Formula One racing plane that was sitting on the field. Now, a Formula One racing plane with this engine that it had was a very high-power motor. It was very early in the morning. It was basically buzzing its engine for a good 15, 20 minutes, very, very loudly, to the point where several of the local residents, if you know anything about Orange County Airport, they have really careful noise ordinances down there. Several of the residents filed reports with the FAA, complaints. The tower people saw the plane on the field. So did a number of other folks. So they had a lot of these things. Now, this is a high-speed propeller, extremely high. They wrote down the registration number of the people who saw the plane, N21X. The FAA determined that there was a noise violation. They released that, and they mailed it out. On July 20th, Bobby Slayton, Deke's wife, his widow, received a letter in the mail dated June 28th. Now, it had been forwarded from another location, so it took her a while to get there, notifying Deke or Donald K. Slayton that he was guilty of violating FAA regulations for noise on June 13th at 7:57 a.m. in this Formula One racing plane, which is something he built by hand. Bobby Slayton telephoned the FAA and inquired if they had all gone crazy. Two reasons. One, Deke was dead. Two, that Formula One racing plane that everybody saw, N21X, was sitting in a museum in Sparks, Nevada for a couple of months before that with its engine outside the plane. Now, people saw this plane actually take off after 15 minutes, which is another problem because, in fact, the plane couldn't have started up without somebody starting. This is one of those propellers it's set up in such a way that somebody actually has to kickstart it. Bobby's comment, by the way, to Martin Caden, my friend Martin Caden, who was the person who gave me this story, and I spoke to Bobby also after this, her comment was that it sat on the ground for 15 minutes because she thought that Deke might have been waiting for the ghost of Gus Grissom, one of his old buddies who died in Apollo 1. Now, he flew off into the sunrise. Kind of an interesting, wonderful story in that way, although the FAA was not too pleased about this. If this was a hoax, it was a very interesting coincidence that somebody had that racing plane out at that, or something similar to it at the exact same time, or shortly after he died. The other story I just want to tell you as we finish up is that sometimes these things do happen to me. I have, over the past several years, never seen a ghost, but my friend Martin Caden, who is a science fiction author and an investigator into the unknown, Marty is an interesting guy. He, among other things, the thing you would know best by him was a book called Cyborg, which became The $6 Million Man. So he's responsible for that. He also wrote a book called Marooned, which became a famous movie, and Marooned was responsible for the Apollo-Soyuz mission, according to the Russians. They read his book and then contacted NASA. Now, Marty died a couple of years ago. About a week and a half after he died, I really expected Marty to show up to me like the next day, and he didn't. About a week and a half later, I was flying up to Portland for a business trip. And I'm driving to the Oakland airport early in the morning. And I had, at that point, a car that was only about 4 months old, so it still had that new car smell in it. All of a sudden, my car filled up with the smell of cigar smoke. And it was identifiably, to my mind, the cigar that Marty Caden smoked. And for about 5 minutes, I really felt his presence in the car. And I talked to him. Of course, people driving by me thought I was singing, so it was okay. But I spoke to him, and then I felt a sense that just something like a really good feeling, and then the smell was completely gone. Now, here's the interesting thing. That was very interesting to me, but the next day I called one of his buddies, and he said, "Loyd, I got to tell you this, before you say anything, Marty showed up." I said, "What are you talking about?" He says, "I was flying my plane, and my cockpit filled up with the smell of cigar smoke." This is the same day that it happened to me. He said, "I also heard the same story," that's what Bob is telling me, "from somebody else, from another pilot," because Marty was an aviation expert. So we figured that, a lot of us figured that the reason it took him a week and a half to get to us is because he had so many people around the world that he had to drop in on. It's things like that that keep me interested. It's things like that. It's not the bad stuff that keeps me interested. It's the fact that people have an amazing capability of connecting with the world around us. We have a truth that we have to connect with that's well beyond the X-Files. It's much beyond Ghostbusters. It's beyond any of the films we know of. We can connect with things around us, and after death, apparently, we can stick around and possibly cause a good feeling for a lot of our friends. Thank you very much for coming. Enjoy the rest of your day.